America did not begin with the White House or a familiar flag. It began with a dangerous Atlantic crossing, with people carrying faith, ambition, fear, and the habits of the Old World. They did not yet call themselves Americans. They were simply trying to survive on a distant shore.
On a 17th century map, there was no single America. There were separate British colonies, divided by distance, law, religion, and economic interest. Massachusetts looked toward the sea, Virginia toward tobacco fields, and Pennsylvania toward trade. No one had designed a united nation. Yet, among these different settlements, a new idea slowly emerged. Life here might follow different rules. Land seemed more abundant. Old social ranks felt weaker, and royal authority stood an ocean away. The pen had not touched the Declaration, but the language of revolution was already forming. Boston was a noisy port of the British Empire. Merchants counted profits, sailors carried news, ministers debated morality, and printers turned rumor into pamphlets. In crowded cities like this, people first felt how decisions made in distant London could reach directly into their daily lives. The South presented a different picture. Vast plantations produced tobacco and wealth, but depended on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. From the beginning, the future republic carried a contradiction within it. Bold claims about liberty existed beside a system that denied liberty to hundreds of thousands. In 1763, Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War and became the dominant power in North America. The colonists seemed to have reason to celebrate, but victory left London with enormous debt, and maintaining troops across the Atlantic was expensive. The Empire decided the colonies should help pay. To British ministers, the new taxes looked like sensible accounting. To the colonists, they meant something far larger. They elected no representatives to Parliament, yet Parliament demanded their money. A dispute over revenue became a deeper question. Can a government take from people without their consent? Royal orders restricted trade and westward settlement. Customs officials searched cargo. Courts heard cases without familiar juries, and soldiers appeared more often in colonial streets. Each policy could seem minor by itself. Together, they created the feeling that the colonies were losing control over their own future. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed newspapers, legal papers, licenses, and even playing cards. The imperial stamp appeared on objects people handled every day. Resistance spread quickly because the burden reached beyond merchants, affecting printers, lawyers, artisans, and ordinary customers across the colonies. In taverns and town meetings, one phrase took hold: no taxation without representation. It was not yet a demand for independence. Most colonists still considered themselves loyal subjects of the king. They asked for the traditional rights of Englishmen. But that demand was already creating a new political identity. In March 1770, tension in Boston ended in blood. A crowd surrounded British soldiers, throwing snow, ice, and insults. Someone shouted, muskets fired, and 5 colonists died. A chaotic street confrontation was quickly transformed by resistance leaders into the event remembered as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere circulated an engraving showing disciplined redcoats firing coldly into defenseless civilians. The image was politically more powerful than an exact report. It reduced a confused encounter to a clear symbol: an armed empire attacking a peaceful people. The revolution was learning how to manufacture visual memory. Newspapers connected the scattered colonies faster than any official institution. Printers reprinted letters, speeches, and accusations, while readers discussed them in workshops, homes, and marketplaces. A farmer in Virginia could hear about Boston and begin to view another colony's conflict as a threat to his own rights. In 1773, Parliament kept the tax on tea while giving the East India Company favorable terms. The tea might actually cost less, but colonists saw a trap. Buying it would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. The issue was no longer the price of a drink, but the price of consent. On the night of December 16th, protesters boarded ships in Boston Harbor and threw hundreds of tea chests into the water. They did not steal the cargo or keep it. This was a carefully staged act of defiance. The black water of the harbor marked a line beyond which compromise became harder. London answered by closing Boston Harbor and restricting self-government in Massachusetts. But punishing one colony produced sympathy in the others. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. They still disagreed about their goals, but for the first time they learned to act as one political body. The same room contained men with sharply different temperaments and beliefs. John Adams favored firm resistance, while others still hoped for reconciliation. Washington spoke little, and Franklin studied the mood. What united them was not a finished plan, but the fear that isolated colonies could be defeated, one by one. The First Continental Congress organized a boycott of British goods and sent a petition to the king. Its language still expressed loyalty, yet the act of making a joint decision was revolutionary. The colonies were building political authority outside imperial institutions, asking London to listen while learning to function without it. In the spring of 1775, British commanders moved to seize colonial militia weapons stored at Concord. Night riders warned the countryside, and armed men gathered along the roads. What began as a secret military operation became a public confrontation between imperial troops and local communities prepared to resist. At dawn in Lexington, two armed lines faced one another through the mist. No one knows with certainty who fired first, but once the first shots sounded, the dispute changed forever. Blood had been spilled, and petitions could no longer erase the fact that British soldiers and colonists were now killing each other. The war required a common army and a common commander. Congress chose George Washington, a wealthy Virginia planter and veteran of earlier frontier fighting. His appointment connected New England's rebellion to the southern colonies and gave the struggle a figure who appeared disciplined, respectable, and national. The army Washington inherited barely resembled a professional force. Soldiers wore mismatched clothing, carried different weapons, served under local officers, and often enlisted for short terms. Supplies were scarce and discipline uneven. Washington's first challenge was not defeating Britain, but turning regional militias into a continental army. During the summer of 1775, American forces surrounded the British garrison in Boston. They could not easily storm the city, but they controlled roads and nearby heights. Washington inspected the lines and discovered both courage and confusion. The siege became a test of whether rebellion could survive long enough to become organized war. On the night before June 17th, colonial troops fortified a hill overlooking Boston. British commanders chose a direct assault. Red-coated infantry advanced uphill in ordered ranks against hastily built defenses. The battle revealed the Empire's power, but also showed that inexperienced colonial soldiers could stand against one of the world's strongest armies. The British captured the position only after repeated attacks and after the defenders ran low on ammunition. Formally, it was a royal victory. The cost made it feel different. British casualties were severe, and commanders learned that crushing the rebellion would demand far more blood than they had expected. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published a small pamphlet called Common Sense. He did not write for lawyers or philosophers, but for ordinary readers. In direct, forceful language, he argued that an island should not rule a continent, and that reconciliation with the crown had become both unrealistic and dangerous. The pamphlet was read aloud in taverns, military camps, and private homes. It gave simple words to feelings many people could not yet express. Before Paine, independence seemed radical and almost unthinkable. After Common Sense, continued loyalty to Britain increasingly became the position that required explanation. For centuries, monarchy had been presented as the natural center of political order. Paine reversed that picture. A king was not the father of a nation, but an ordinary man protected by ceremony and inherited privilege. Once the crown lost its sacred appearance, separation became easier to imagine. That summer, Thomas Jefferson was asked to explain the break with Britain. Working by candlelight in a rented Philadelphia room, he drew on ideas of natural rights and government by consent. His task was larger than listing grievances. He had to transform rebellion into a moral argument before the world. The Declaration's most famous claim was that all men are created equal and possess unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were more universal than the society that produced them. They gave the Revolution a standard by which later generations would judge its founders. Beside the Declaration stood the reality of slavery. Roughly 1/5 of the colonial population was enslaved, and many revolutionary leaders owned human beings. The new nation announced liberty while protecting bondage. That contradiction was not hidden at the edges of American history. It stood near the center. Jefferson wrote about freedom and returned to a plantation whose economy depended on unfree labor. This was not merely a private inconsistency. It represented the structure of the emerging republic. Wealth, political influence, and slavery were deeply connected, especially in the southern states. Women, indigenous peoples, poor men without property, and enslaved people did not enter the new political system as equals. Yet revolutionary language could not be fully controlled by those who first used it. Once equality and natural rights were declared, excluded groups gained words with which to challenge exclusion. While Congress debated principles, an enormous British fleet entered New York Harbor. London sent tens of thousands of soldiers and hired German troops. This was not a police action against a few agitators. The Empire intended to destroy the rebellion by overwhelming force and to seize the colony's most important port. Washington lost the battle for New York and barely escaped encirclement. His army retreated across New Jersey as soldiers deserted and enlistments expired. The revolution appeared close to collapse. Independence had been declared in summer, but by winter, the government that announced it seemed unable to defend it. By December 1776, the situation was desperate. Britain controlled the largest city, and the American army was dissolving. Washington chose a dangerous gamble: cross the ice-filled Delaware River during a storm and strike the enemy garrison at Trenton before dawn. Boats forced their way between ice floes as wet snow struck the soldiers' faces. Artillery had to be dragged along muddy roads. The operation fell hours behind schedule, but the terrible weather also concealed it. Exhausted men continued marching because failure might mean the end of the army. At morning, the Americans surprised the garrison and captured Trenton. The victory was limited in military scale, but enormous in psychological effect. Soldiers re-enlisted, civilians recovered confidence, and the revolution gained time. Washington had shown that even a retreating army could still choose the moment of attack. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada toward the Hudson River, hoping to isolate New England. But forests, poor roads, and American resistance slowed his column. Supplies ran short, local support failed to appear, and the invading army became trapped far from help. Near Saratoga, Burgoyne was surrounded and forced to surrender. An entire British army went into captivity. The victory transformed the war because it convinced foreign observers that the Americans might actually survive. France now had evidence that supporting the rebellion could weaken its oldest rival. After Saratoga, France entered a formal alliance with the United States. Benjamin Franklin played a central role at Versailles, presenting himself as a plain Republican sage while skillfully navigating court politics. French leaders did not suddenly embrace American ideals. They saw a strategic opportunity to damage Britain. The French Navy was especially important. As long as Britain controlled the sea, it could move armies, supply garrisons, and choose where to attack. French warships challenged that advantage, turning a colonial rebellion into a military contest Britain could no longer manage on its own terms. Once France entered the conflict, the war spread across the Caribbean, Europe, Africa, and India. Britain had to defend trade routes and colonies around the globe. American independence was now connected to a worldwide imperial struggle, forcing London to divide ships, money, and attention. Meanwhile, the Continental Army endured the winter at Valley Forge. The famous image of bloody footprints in snow became legend, but the suffering was real. Food was irregular, clothing inadequate, disease widespread, and many soldiers lived in rough wooden huts through bitter cold. At Valley Forge, the Prussian officer Friedrich von Steuben introduced common drills, commands, formations, and camp procedures. He did more than teach parade movements. Standardized training allowed soldiers from different states to maneuver as one force. The army that emerged in spring was smaller, but more professional and dependable. Britain shifted its main efforts south, expecting strong support from local loyalists. In 1780, Charleston fell, and thousands of American soldiers surrendered. The defeat seemed catastrophic. British leaders believed control of the southern ports would allow them to rebuild royal authority across the countryside. Instead, The Carolinas descended into brutal civil conflict. Small patriot units ambushed British detachments and disappeared into swamps and forests. Loyalists and revolutionaries settled local scores, dividing families and communities. The Southern War showed that the Revolution was not only a fight against Britain, but also a civil war among Americans. Nathanael Greene took command of the Southern Army and refused to defend every town. He retreated, divided his forces, and forced the British to pursue him across difficult country. Greene often lost individual battles, yet each engagement weakened the enemy. His strategy was to preserve the army while exhausting Britain's ability to occupy the region. Cornwallis marched into Virginia and fortified Yorktown, expecting supplies and rescue by sea. Washington initially planned to attack New York, but intelligence changed the opportunity. American and French forces moved south rapidly, hiding their true destination until the British position was nearly surrounded. A French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay and prevented the Royal Navy from evacuating Cornwallis. On land, Allied soldiers dug trenches and moved artillery closer to the British defenses. Yorktown became the rare moment when American troops, French troops, and French naval power acted in precise coordination. The peace treaty was signed in Paris in 1783. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and granted it territory extending to the Mississippi River. The new country was vast on paper, but victory did not automatically create a functioning government, stable finances, or agreement among the states. The first national system, the Articles of Confederation, left most authority with the states. Congress could negotiate and declare war, but it had little power to tax or enforce its decisions. The arrangement protected local independence, yet made it difficult to pay debts, regulate commerce, or respond to national crises. States issued different currencies, imposed tariffs on neighbors, and argued over trade. Many citizens identified first as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians, rather than as Americans. The country had won independence from Britain, but it had not yet decided how much independence the states should surrender to one another. In Massachusetts, farmers burdened by debt and taxes began closing courts to prevent property seizures. The uprising was associated with Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army captain. To many rural families, the new government seemed to be protecting creditors with the same harshness once associated with imperial rule. When insurgents moved toward the federal arsenal at Springfield, they were stopped by a militia funded largely by private citizens. The national government lacked the resources to respond effectively. For influential leaders, the crisis suggested that the Confederation was too weak to maintain order or protect the revolution's achievements. In the summer of 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia, officially to revise the Articles. They closed the windows, kept the debates secret, and worked through oppressive heat. Instead of repairing the old system, they designed an entirely new constitution with a stronger national government. The delegates fought over representation, presidential power, courts, taxation, and the military. They feared both centralized tyranny and uncontrolled democracy. Every solution created another danger. The Constitution emerged not from complete agreement, but from compromise among people who distrusted one another's preferred forms of power. Washington presided over the convention and rarely entered the debate. His presence gave the meeting legitimacy. Everyone understood that if a presidency were created, he would probably be the first to hold it. Trust in one man's restraint helped delegates build an office that could later be occupied by less trusted men. The Constitution began with the words, "We the people," yet it preserved the union with slavery. It protected the return of fugitives from bondage and delayed any federal ban on the international slave trade. National unity was purchased partly through concessions to states whose power depended on human captivity. The 3/5 Compromise counted enslaved people as part of a population used to assign seats in the House of Representatives, even though those people had no vote. The formula increased the political power of slaveholding states. Human beings were treated simultaneously as property and as numbers that strengthened their owners' representation. In 1789, Washington took the presidential oath in New York City. There was no established executive mansion, no completed bureaucracy, and no settled tradition for the office. Every choice, from appointments to ceremonies, could become a precedent. The new government had to invent itself while already exercising power. What Washington refused to do mattered as much as what he did. He did not turn popularity into lifetime rule or surround himself with a royal court. Presidential authority developed under the example of a leader who repeatedly presented power as temporary, constitutional, and ultimately returnable to the public. Even forms of address caused anxiety. A title too grand sounded monarchical, while one too plain might weaken the office. Washington balanced ceremony with Republican restraint. The debate revealed how deeply Americans feared reproducing the monarchy they had rejected, even while creating a powerful executive. Many states ratified the Constitution only after supporters promised explicit protections for individual liberty. In 1791, the first 10 amendments took effect. The Bill of Rights protected speech, religion, assembly, due process, and other freedoms against the new federal government. These amendments did not resolve every contradiction, and their protections were not experienced equally by everyone, but they created a durable political language. Citizens could now criticize government not only by appealing to abstract justice, but by invoking written rights that public officials were expected to respect. Conflict quickly emerged inside Washington's cabinet. Alexander Hamilton favored a strong federal government, public credit, industry, and a national bank. Thomas Jefferson feared concentrated power and imagined a republic rooted in agriculture and local independence. Their rivalry helped create the first American political parties. Newspapers became weapons of partisan warfare. Opponents were accused of monarchy, atheism, treason, corruption, and secret loyalty to foreign powers. The founders did not practice calm, polite politics. The young republic discovered that freedom of the press could protect debate while also making public life vicious and unstable. War between Britain and revolutionary France divided Americans. Some remembered French assistance and supported the revolution abroad. Others feared violence and valued British trade. The United States was still militarily weak, and choosing either side risked pulling the new nation into a conflict it might not survive. By 1800, partisan hostility had reached a breaking point. President John Adams and the Federalists feared French influence, while Jefferson's supporters warned that the government was sliding toward repression. The election raised a fundamental question. Could rivals treat political defeat as temporary, or would they destroy the system to keep power? Thomas Jefferson won. His supporters called the result the Revolution of 1800, but its most important feature was the absence of soldiers in the streets. Federalists surrendered control of the government to their opponents through constitutional procedures. Peaceful transfer of power became one of the Republic's strongest claims to legitimacy. In only a few decades, the colonies moved from petitions to independence, from an improvised army to international victory, and from a weak confederation to a federal constitution. None of these steps was inevitable. At several moments, the entire project could have broken apart. The revolution was not made only by Isuzu men in portraits. Soldiers endured hunger, women managed farms and followed armies, printers spread arguments, diplomats secured alliances, and ordinary families absorbed the cost. Enslaved and indigenous people also made choices under pressure, often seeking freedom or survival wherever they believed it might be found. The Liberty Bell acquired its famous crack later, yet it is an almost perfect symbol for early America. The Republic proclaimed universal principles while remaining fractured by slavery, exclusion, and regional interest. The promise was powerful, precisely because the reality fell so far short of it. Later generations repeatedly returned to the Declaration. Abolitionists asked how equality could coexist with slavery. Women used its language to demand political rights. Civil rights leaders insisted that the nation honor its own creed. The founding words became tools for challenging the society that had written them. That is why the American Revolution did not truly end in 1783 or even in 1800. It left the country with a question that every generation has had to answer again. Who is included in the promise of liberty, and what must change before those words become real?